Reverend Josiah Pratt stood at the altar of Cutter's Ridge Chapel with his Bible pressed flat against his chest and told Silas Rourke, in front of the whole gathered congregation, that he would not marry a rancher to a Korean woman inside a house of God. Not today, not ever. The silence afterward was so complete that Hyun Baek could hear her own pulse over the wind rattling the window panes. She had worn her mother's indigo ribbon knotted through her braid for luck. Silas did not raise his voice. He only turned his hat once in his hands, slow, like a man deciding something final. The one kindness in that cold room came from an unlikely place, the Reverend's own housekeeper, gray-haired Agatha Voss, who would not meet her employer's eyes but pressed a warm biscuit wrapped in cloth into Haeun's palm on the church steps, murmuring that some men mistook fear for scripture. Silas Rourke said nothing to the congregation at all. He walked Haeun to the wagon, settled his coat over her shoulders, though the morning was not yet cold enough to need it, and told her only this, quiet enough that no one else could hear: "I am not asking that man again. I am finding one who will say yes the first time." By noon he had saddled his gray gelding, filled a saddlebag with hardtack and a wool blanket, and strapped on the revolver he rarely wore into town anymore. 60 miles lay between Cutter's Ridge and the county courthouse at Larimer Flats. 60 miles of open range, river crossing, and the kind of sky that could turn white without warning in November. Haeun asked him, in English still careful and deliberate, if he would truly ride so far only for a signature and a stranger's blessing. Silas swung up into the saddle before he answered her, and even then he only said, "For you, it isn't far at all." She watched him become smaller against the horizon until the gray gelding was only a dark seed on pale grass, then nothing, and the whole of Cutter's Ridge seemed to exhale and lean in to watch her watching. Some faces at the windows held pity, most held only curiosity, the particular hunger of a town that had run out of its own stories. Haeun pressed her mother's ribbon between her fingers and did not let herself imagine the three things that could stop a man on 60 miles of open winter road: a lamed horse, a flooded crossing, or a sky that had already begun, faintly, to spit snow. Haeun Baek had come to Wyoming Territory the way her father had, 3 years before her, chasing the promise written on a company handbill: honest wages, honest land, for any man willing to break his back on the spur line. The railroad was cutting through the high country. Baek Do-yoon had sent for her the moment he had saved enough, and she had crossed an ocean and half a continent to reach him, only to arrive in Cutter's Ridge 4 days after a rock slide above the grading camp had buried him under 2 tons of shale meant for a trestle he would never see finished. The foreman gave her his last wages in a tin box and his boots, which did not fit her, and no one else in town gave her anything at all beyond the room, above the mercantile that her father's back pay had already, quietly, purchased. She had her mother's remedies in her memory, her mother's needle in her hand, and a square of indigo silk cut from her mother's wedding handbook folded inside a bojagi bundle that never left her sight. She learned quickly which doors in Cutter's Ridge would open to a woman who mended shirts and set bones, and which ones would not, no matter how well the mending held. The town tolerated her the way it tolerated bad weather, as something to be endured rather than welcomed, and Haeun learned the shape of that toleration precisely. She could stitch a torn coat, but not sit at the church supper, could set a broken wrist, but not be handed change directly into her palm at the mercantile counter, could be thanked in a low voice on an empty street and cut dead the next morning if anyone else was watching. She kept her English simple on purpose those first months. Thank you, good day, 5 cents. Because a woman who spoke carefully was underestimated less than a woman who tried and failed at anything more. She practiced the harder sentences alone at night, reading a torn newspaper by lamplight, sounding out words like territory and homestead and once want, turning that last one over for a long time before she blew out the flame. She did not know yet that the man who would teach her the rest of the language, patiently and without once laughing at her mistakes, was at that very hour 3 miles outside town, bleeding into his own saddle. Silas Rourke rode into Cutter's Ridge after dark with a bullet crease along his ribs, from a bounty gone wrong outside Sweetwater, and the town's only doctor was 2 days gone to a birth in the next county. So a boy ran for the one person left who was known to sew a clean line. Haeun found him slumped against the livery wall, gray-faced, one hand pressed to a wound already soaking through his shirt, and she did not ask his name before she cut the fabric away and began to work. Her stitches were small and even, a skill her mother had taught her over a dying grandmother's bedside long before either of them had ever heard the word Wyoming, and she worked in the particular silence of a woman who trusted her hands to say more than her English could in a crisis. He watched her thread the needle with hands that did not shake at all, and when she finally spoke, it was only to tell him, in her careful, deliberate English, to hold still or hold his tongue, whichever he found easier. He held still. He did not, she noticed, once look away from her face, even when the needle went in, as though the pain were easier to bear than looking anywhere else in that lamplit stable. And by the time she tied off the last stitch, something unnamed had already passed between them, quiet and unhurried as the lamp's own low flame. He paid her the following week, in coin and in silence, and left before she could refuse either. It was 3 more weeks before he came back at all, this time on no medical pretext whatsoever. Only a sack of flour he claimed had been left over from a trade and a question, badly disguised as idle, about whether her roof had been fixed before the last hard rain. Heian told him the truth, that it had not, and that she had caught the worst of the leak in her father's old tin box, the same one that had once held his final wages. Silas said nothing further that day. 3 mornings later, she woke to the sound of hammering and found him on her roof at first light, methodical and silent, replacing shingles she had not asked him to touch, in a town that had made very clear it did not want him touching anything of hers at all. She brought him coffee she could not really spare, and he drank it standing in her doorway rather than sitting, as though sitting might make the visit into something the town could more easily gossip about. And neither of them spoke much more than the weather, though both of them, she suspected, understood the roof for the sentence it actually was. Word of the roof traveled faster than the actual sound of the hammer had. By the following Sunday, the saloon had already decided what it meant, and a rancher's son named Cole Dunmore said so loudly enough, outside the mercantile, that Heian heard every word through the open door, that Silas Rourke had gone soft in the head over a foreign woman who ought to be grateful for whatever attention a decent white man wasted on her. Silas had not been in earshot. He arrived 4 minutes later to find Heian standing very still at the counter, her chin level, refusing to let her face answer for her. And when the storekeeper repeated the remark for his benefit, half laughing, Silas set his money down without comment, walked out, and did not return to that store again for the rest of the year, taking his considerable business to the smaller trading post at the edge of town instead. He never mentioned the insult to Heian directly. He only from that day forward made certain he was seen walking the same street she walked at the same hour whenever their errands allowed it. She began teaching him words without either of them naming the lessons as such. A bowl of rice one evening became bap, said slowly, and he repeated it back wrong twice before he got the shape of it right, and she laughed, actually laughed, for what she realized afterward was the first time since crossing the ocean. He asked eventually what the word for thank you was, and when she told him gomawo, he used it so often over the following weeks, for small things, a held door, a passed tool, that it stopped sounding foreign in his mouth at all, and she found herself listening for it the way some women listen for their own names. In return, he corrected nothing in her English except when she asked him to, and even then only gently, sitting across her small table with the lamp between them, telling her once that her accent did not need fixing, only her confidence did, and that the town's opinion of either was not worth the coal oil she was burning to worry about it. She wrote his corrections down anyway, in a small hand, in the margins of the same torn newspaper she had once practiced alone by lamplight, and kept the page long after the newsprint itself had gone yellow and unreadable. It was Agatha Voss, of all people, who first asked Heian outright whether she loved him, catching her alone at the well, one gray morning in early autumn, and Heian's answer surprised herself more than it surprised the older woman, that she did not know love was allowed to feel this quiet, this much like simply being able to breathe again after months of holding it carefully in. Agatha only nodded, the way a woman nods at a truth she has already lived through once herself, and told her something that stayed with Heian for weeks afterward, that Silas Rourke had not smiled properly, not once. Not that anyone in Cutter's Ridge could recall, in the 4 years since his younger sister Bess had frozen to death not 2 miles from this very well, waiting for a brother who came home a day too late from a cattle drive to find her. Agatha said it plainly, without cruelty, the way frontier women learned to hand grief to one another, fact laid beside fact. And then she picked her bucket back up and went on drawing water as though she had not just handed Haeyeon the missing half of a man she was already, quietly, learning to love. Haeyeon did not ask him about it directly, not for a long while, understanding instinctively that some grief has to be handed over rather than pried loose. Instead, she watched him more closely after that. The way his eyes went to the sky before any ride longer than an afternoon. The way he kept a second blanket in his saddlebag even on clear days. The way he had built, she learned, a small stone marker at the edge of his own land that the town had quietly stopped mentioning years ago, out of something that might have been mercy. One evening, unprompted, he told her the rest of it himself, plainly, without asking for comfort, that Bess had gone out looking for a stray milk cow in a whiteout no one had predicted, that he had been 3 days out on the range and had not known to worry until it was already too late, and that he had promised himself, kneeling in that snow, never again to let distance be the reason he failed someone he loved. He told it to her without tears, in the flat, careful voice of a man who had rehearsed the facts so many times alone that the grief had worn smooth in places, like a stone carried too long in a pocket, and Haeyeon understood that he was not asking her to fix any of it, only trusting her to carry the weight of knowing it alongside him now. Autumn deepened into the kind of cold that turned the grass silver by morning, and Silas began appearing at Haeyeon's door with a frequency that no longer required any pretext of flower or roofs. He brought her, instead, small unnecessary things, a length of blue ribbon from the mercantile he had gone out of his way to purchase from the smaller trading posts instead, a jar of honey, a book of English poems he could not fully explain why he had thought she would want. Haeyeon kept the ribbon beside her mother's indigo silk in the bojagi bundle, two blues that did not quite match and did not need to. She had stopped, somewhere in those weeks, translating her own feelings into careful English sentences before she let herself feel them, and had started simply feeling them instead, in whichever language arrived first, which was increasingly no language at all, only the plain fact of watching for a particular hat coming up her street. She did not tell him this, she did not need to. He had begun, without comment, timing his own errands to the hour her window usually caught the last of the afternoon light, as though some part of him had made the same quiet arithmetic she had. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday, which she would later find almost unbearably funny, given how much thought he had clearly put into every other part of it and how little into the calendar. He had walked her to the ridge above his own homestead at dusk, the one place in the county where the wind briefly quieted enough for a man to hear his own voice, and told her, without any of the flourish the poems he had bought her were full of, that he had buried one person he loved because he had let distance decide things for him once, and he did not intend to spend what remained of his life letting distance, or a town's opinion, or anything else decide anything again. Haeyeon answered him first in Korean, a single word she then had to translate for him, slowly, watching his face change as he understood. "Yes," she had said. "Yes, since before you finished asking." The wind that had gone quiet for exactly long enough to let them hear each other picked back up the moment the word left her, as though the ridge itself had only been holding its breath politely, and they stood there a while longer anyway, in no particular hurry to walk back down into a town that did not yet know what it was about to be told. The town found out within 2 days, the way the town found out about everything, and the reactions split exactly as Haeyeon had learned to expect. The Dunmore men loud and ugly about it at the saloon, a handful of quieter households simply closing their doors a little more firmly than before, and a small, unexpected minority, Agatha Voss chief among them, who began, almost defiantly, greeting Haeyeon by name on the street where they had not troubled to before. The mercantile owner's wife brought over a length of good cloth, unasked, and left before Haeyeon could properly thank her, saying only over her shoulder that a wedding deserved a decent dress regardless of whose it was. Haeyeon sewed that dress herself over 3 long evenings, working her mother's stitching into the seams where no one but she would ever notice it. A small private grammar of home folded invisibly into cloth that the whole of Cutter's Ridge would soon be looking at without ever seeing, and did not yet know that the harder test of the town's tolerance was still a full week away, waiting for her at the chapel door. Silas rode to see Reverend Pratt himself, 3 days before the date they had chosen. Not out of any real doubt, but out of the plain courtesy of asking a man to do his job before assuming he would refuse to. The Reverend received him politely enough in his study, offered coffee, asked after the herd, and it was only when Silas finally said Heyoon's name alongside the word wedding that something in the older man's face closed like a door being latched from the inside. Pratt did not say no that day. He said only that he would need to think on it, to pray on it, phrases Silas had heard often enough from cautious men to recognize as a no already decided and merely being dressed for church. He rode home and told Heyoon nothing of his suspicion, choosing instead to let her have one more week of simply, uncomplicatedly, looking forward to something, before the town found a way, as it usually did, to take that from her too. He busied himself instead with ordinary preparations, mending the corral gate, writing to a cousin in Cheyenne for a proper pair of boots she would not have to break in on her wedding day, small useful labors that let him carry a private worry without ever setting it down in front of her. The morning of the wedding came in hard and bright, the first true frost of the year silvering every fence post between Heyoon's room above the Mercantile and the little white chapel at the end of Cutter's Ridge's single real street. She dressed alone since she had no mother or sister within 9,000 miles to help her, and found she did not mind it as much as she had feared. Agatha Voss arrived uninvited an hour before the ceremony anyway, pinned the blue ribbon into Heyoon's hair herself with the practiced hands of a woman who had dressed several daughters for several weddings, and told her, gruffly, that she looked like exactly what she was, which was a woman about to marry a man lucky enough to have her. Heyoon tucked her mother's indigo silk into the bodice of the dress, close against her heart, where it had ridden through an ocean crossing and a father's funeral, and now, she hoped, a wedding too. She stood a long while before the small, cracked mirror above her washstand afterward, not admiring the dress so much as memorizing the woman wearing it, as though some part of her already understood that whatever the morning held, she wanted to remember exactly how steady she had looked before it happened. Silas waited outside the chapel, rather than in it, in his one good coat, turning his hat in his hands in the particular way Heyoon had come to recognize as nervousness he refused to name as such. The street had filled more than either of them expected. Some of it was ordinary Sunday habit. Most of it, Heyoon understood, as she walked toward him in her borrowed cloth dress with her mother's ribbon in her hair, was simple appetite, a town that had decided, whichever way this went, it did not intend to miss the watching of it. Silas took her hand at the chapel steps and did not let go of it again, not through the murmurs, not through the stares, not even when Reverend Pratt appeared in the chapel doorway a full minute later than a punctual man like him ever ran, his Bible already in his hands as though he had needed something to hold on to before facing them. Heyoon felt the whole street's attention settle against her shoulders like a physical weight, and made herself breathe the way her mother had once taught her to breathe through pain that could not be avoided, only endured until it passed through and out the other side. They stood at the threshold together, while the congregation settled into pews behind them, with the particular hush of people pretending not to watch closely. Pratt looked at Heyoon for a long moment, longer than courtesy required, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not, in that moment, name, though she would think about it for weeks afterward, some private struggle that never quite surfaced into words. Then he looked past her to Silas, and his expression settled into something colder and more certain. The look of a man who has argued himself into a decision he does not entirely believe, and has decided to hide that fact behind volume instead. Heyoon felt Silas's hand tighten around hers, not painfully, only firmly, a small and involuntary bracing, as though some part of him had already guessed what the Reverend's face had just finished deciding, 3 full steps before either of them reached the altar to hear it spoken aloud. She had walked into that doorway hoping the town's opinion of her had shifted since the day she arrived. She left it understanding that hope and evidence were 2 entirely different animals, and that she had, without quite noticing, been feeding the wrong one. Reverend Pratt did not invite them inside. He stopped them at the very doorway of his own chapel, Bible pressed to his chest, and said, loud enough for the first 3 pews and the street both to hear clearly, that he would not perform this marriage, that scripture and his own conscience both forbade joining a Christian rancher to a heathen foreign woman inside a house of God, and that Silas would thank him for it eventually, however it stung today. The word heathen landed on Heyoon harder than any of the rest of it, unfair in a way she had not braced for, since she had knelt beside Silas in that very building 3 Sundays running, without a single soul asking what she believed before deciding what she was. She did not cry. She had promised herself, crossing that ocean once already for a different funeral entirely, that Cutter's Ridge would never see her cry in public again, whatever it cost her to keep that promise standing at an altar that had just been closed to her. She fixed her eyes instead on a knot in the chapel's front step, the same knot she had noticed on her very first Sunday in this town, and let it hold her steady, the way a fixed point on a rolling ship holds a sailor's stomach, steady until the ringing in her ears finally, slowly, began to quiet. Silas did not raise his voice at the Reverend, though half the street seemed to be waiting for him to, hungry for exactly that kind of scene. He only turned his hat over once in his hands, the gesture Hyun now recognized as him deciding something, and said, quiet enough that only the front pews caught it clearly, that he understood the Reverend had made his choice, and that he would go make one of his own now too. Agatha Voss stepped forward from the crowd. Before anyone else could speak further, pressed a warm biscuit wrapped in cloth into Hyun's hand, as though it could substitute for every kindness the town had failed to offer that morning, and murmured, not quite low enough, that some men mistook their own fear for scripture and would spend the rest of their lives calling it faith instead. Reverend Pratt's jaw tightened at that. He said nothing back. For one unguarded second, watching him, Hyun thought she saw something closer to shame than certainty cross his face, gone before she could be sure of it. Silas walked her to the wagon himself, settled his coat over her shoulders, though the morning had not yet turned properly cold, and told her, low enough that the gathered street could make of it what they liked, that he was not going to ask that man again. He was going to find someone who would say yes to them the first time asked, and he knew exactly where to look. Larimer Flats, he said. The county seat, 60 miles east across open range in the Wind River country, kept a justice of the peace named Ruth Calloway, who married any two willing adults who walked into her courtroom, and had done so by local reputation, for a Chinese laundryman and an Irish widow the previous spring without so much as raising an eyebrow. Hyun asked him, careful and deliberate in the English she had built for exactly this kind of moment, whether he intended to ride there today now, with the sky already carrying that particular flat gray look that came before weather. Silas told her only today. She did not argue with him, understanding already that this was not a decision open for discussion so much as a fact he was informing her of, and some part of her, frightened as she was, found a strange comfort in being married, even unofficially, to exactly that kind of certainty. He was saddled and provisioned within the hour, his gray gelding fed and watered and rested from an easy week, a wool blanket and hardtack packed into the saddlebag alongside the revolver he kept oiled but rarely wore into town. Hyun helped him check the cinch with hands that would not quite stop wanting something useful to do, and it was there, at the corral fence, that she finally asked him the question she had been holding back since the chapel doorway, whether 60 miles, in November, with a storm already gathering its breath somewhere west of the mountains, was truly worth the risk for nothing more than a stranger's signature and a 5-minute ceremony. Silas considered the question longer than she expected before answering it, watching the gray sky the way a man reads a familiar and untrustworthy face, and told her that he had once let 60 miles matter less than it should have for someone else entirely, and had spent 4 years since paying for that mistake in a currency no bank recognized. He did not name Bess. He did not need to. Hyun had already learned the shape of that particular silence, the specific weight it carried, and understood that the question she had asked him about the storm was not really the one he was answering at all. He did not explain Bess to her fully in that moment, only enough, the bare shape of it, a sister and a blizzard, and 3 days he could not get back, no matter how hard he had tried since. Hyun understood then, watching his face, that this ride was never only about the Reverend or the signature at all, that some older debt was riding with him too, one he intended this time to pay differently. She pressed her mother's indigo ribbon into his hand before he mounted, an instinct she did not fully examine until afterward, telling him only that it had crossed one ocean already and had never once failed to come home. Silas tied it carefully around his wrist over the leather of his glove and told her he would bring it back to her himself before answering whether he would keep it. Then he swung up into the saddle, and Cutter's Ridge, every window of it, turned to watch a gunslinger ride east into a whitening sky for a wedding that had not yet been granted him. The first hours after he left were the easiest, filled with the ordinary business of the day, mending to finish, a fire to keep fed, the ribbon-shaped absence at her wrist where she kept reaching for a piece of silk that was no longer there. Agatha Voss appeared at her door before noon without being asked and stayed, Ostensibly to help with a quilt neither of them had any real interest in finishing, though both women understood the visit for what it actually was. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted, coming harder and colder out of the northwest, rattling the same window panes that had gone silent in the chapel that morning, and Hyen found herself standing at her single window more often than she sat at her sewing, watching a horizon that gave back nothing but gray. Agatha, without being asked, banked the fire higher than the room strictly needed, and said only that a good horse and a stubborn man had gotten through worse than this before, though her own eyes kept finding the window too. Neither woman said Bess's name aloud that evening, though both of them were thinking of her, the specific arithmetic of distance and cold that had already claimed one person this town loved, and the quilt between them went largely, mercifully, unfinished. By evening, word of the morning's refusal had traveled the length of Cutter's Ridge and grown teeth along the way, as such things did, and a delegation of sorts arrived at Hyun's door after dark. Not the Dunmores, who preferred shouting from a distance, but two respectable-looking women from the church sewing circle who informed her, with the particular gentleness people use when delivering cruelty, they have convinced themselves is kindness, that perhaps it would be easier for everyone, herself included, if she simply took the next eastbound train before Silas Rourke made himself any more of a fool over her than he already had. Hyun thanked them for their concern in English that did not shake, closed the door with more calm than she felt behind it, and sat for a long while afterward with her father's old tin box in her lap, turning over, seriously for the first time since the funeral, precisely how much a train ticket east would cost, and how little, if she was honest with herself, would truly be lost if she simply disappeared before anyone had to choose her out loud. It was Reverend Pratt himself, unexpectedly, who put a stop to that particular thought, arriving at her door near midnight with no lantern and no Bible, only his housekeeper Agatha, trailing a careful few steps behind him, as though she did not entirely trust him alone with this errand. He did not apologize, not exactly, standing stiff and uncertain on Hyun's small landing in a way that made him look, for the first time since she had known him, more like an old man afraid than a man of any particular authority. He told her only that he had buried his own wife 11 years ago in a territory that had not yet decided whether it was civilized, and that he had promised himself then never to preside over another vow he did not, in his own heart, believe was honestly meant, and that his refusal that morning had had less to do with Hyeon herself than with a fear he was not yet brave enough to name aloud, even now, even to her. Hyeon listened to all of it without offering him the easy grace of interrupting, understanding that a man confessing something this late at night deserved at least the courtesy of being allowed to finish, however long it took him to get there. It was not forgiveness what passed between them on that landing, and Hyeon did not offer him any, not yet, not with Silas somewhere out in a darkening November sky she could not see the end of. But it was something adjacent to honesty, which she found she could work with more easily than she could have worked with continued cold contempt. And when Pratt asked awkwardly whether there was anything he could do for her that night, she surprised them both by answering plainly that he could stop the sewing circle from suggesting she leave before her own wedding had even been properly refused twice. Agatha, listening from the doorway, made a sound that might have been a laugh trying to force its way through worry. Pratt promised stiffly that he would. Then he left as he had come, into a wind that had begun, faintly but unmistakably, to carry the first dry grains of snow, somewhere 60 miles west of wherever Silas Rourke now was. Agatha lingered a moment longer at the door, told Hyun to bank her own fire high and try to sleep regardless, and left her, finally alone with a lamp, a locked door, and the particular arithmetic every waiting woman on that frontier eventually learned to do against her will. Silas had covered better than half the distance by the time the light began seriously failing, the gray gelding holding a steady mile-eating pace across range grass gone stiff and pale with frost. And for the first 20 miles, the ride had felt almost easy, almost like any other errand, the kind of clean physical work a man could lose himself gratefully inside of. It was the crossing at Willow Fork that first slowed him, the water running higher and colder than the season should have allowed, forcing him a mile upstream to find footing solid enough to trust his horse's legs to it. He crossed dry enough at the shoulders, but soaked to the boot, and did not stop to build a fire and dry them properly, calculating, correctly, that an hour lost now to comfort might be an hour he could not afford to spend later, when the light was gone entirely and the temperature had dropped past, merely uncomfortable, into something a wet boot could genuinely suffer for. He ate the last of his hardtack in the saddle rather than stop for it properly, chewing methodically. While the gray gelding picked its own careful way over ground, he no longer trusted his own eyes to read as well as the horse's feet could. The snow that had only threatened over Cutter's Ridge arrived in earnest west of the fork, not the soft, ornamental kind, but the flat, wind-driven kind that erased a horizon in the space of 20 minutes and turned a known trail into an argument between memory and instinct. Silas had ridden through weather before. He had not, since Bess, ridden through weather quite like this, without the specific cold-throated fear, finding him regardless of how many times. He told himself the two situations bore no real resemblance to each other. He was a grown man on a good horse with daylight, however failing, still technically on his side, not a 14-year-old girl on foot, chasing a stray cow in a whiteout that had come from nowhere. He said this to himself more than once, aloud, into wind that took the words apart before they finished leaving his mouth and kept the gray gelding moving east regardless, one careful mile folding into the next. He thought, too, of the biscuit Agatha had pressed into Hoyun's hand that morning, of the particular kindness of women who had learned to offer warmth in small, deniable portions, and let that small memory carry him a mile or two further than his own legs, at that point, might otherwise have managed alone. He found the second crossing worse than the first, the ford at Cutter's Bend running high and dark under a skin of thin new ice that cracked audibly when the gelding's forehoof tested it. And for one long, suspended second, Silas genuinely did not know whether the horse would go through or hold. It held. He crossed at a careful walk, every muscle in his own body clenched as though that could somehow lighten the weight he was asking 4 legs to carry across ice that had no real obligation to cooperate. And on the far bank, he dismounted anyway, hands numb enough that the reins felt like rope made of wood, to check the gray's legs by feel in the near dark for any strain the crossing might have cost it. The ribbon at his wrist, soaked through now like everything else, had gone stiff with cold, and he found himself, absurdly, apologizing to it under his breath for the state he had gotten it into, as though a length of silk could carry a promise back to the woman who had tied it there. Full dark found him still 11 miles out from Larimer Flats, further behind schedule than any version of his plan had allowed for, with the storm settled in properly around him now, and the temperature dropped low enough that he had begun, deliberately, reciting the names of Hyun's Korean words back to himself, one at a time, Bap and Gomawo, and the handful of others she had taught him, purely to keep his own mind occupied with something other than the particular cold creeping into fingers that no longer felt entirely like his own. It was somewhere in that stretch, half frozen and reciting a language he barely knew to keep himself awake in the saddle, that he understood with sudden, complete clarity exactly how close this was starting to resemble the night he had lost Bess, and understood, in the same breath, that he would rather die on this exact stretch of frozen ground than arrive at Larimer Flats even 1 hour too late for it to matter. He said her name once, plainly, into the dark, Hyun, the way a man tests a rope before he trusts his full weight to it, and found that it held and kept the gray gelding pointed east on nothing more than that. The lights of Larimer Flats found him before he found them. A scatter of lamplit windows swimming up out of the white like something imagined rather than real, and Silas nearly rode past the courthouse entirely in the storm's confusion, before a lit window on its second floor caught his eye. Curtains open, a woman's shape moving behind a desk at an hour when any sensible person in that weather would have long since gone to bed. He half fell rather than dismounted from the gray gelding, legs refusing at first to remember how walking worked, and pounded on the courthouse door with a fist that had stopped entirely, reporting sensation back to him. It took Justice Ruth Calloway less than a minute to answer, lamp in hand, and less than 5 more to have him seated by her own stove with a blanket around his shoulders and a mug of something hot pressed insistently into hands too numb to properly hold it without her steadying them herself. She asked no questions at all in those first minutes, working instead with the brisk, unhurried competence of a woman who had pulled more than one frozen fool off her own doorstep before, and knew that warmth, not conversation, came first. He told her the whole of it before the mug was even half empty. The refusal, the 60 miles, the reason he had ridden them rather than argued them. And Ruth Calloway listened without once interrupting. The particular quality of attention Silas recognized in her as the same thing Hayon had shown him once over a bleeding wound in a livery stable. Someone who worked first and asked questions only where the working required it. When he finished, she set down her own cup, considered him for a long moment with an expression that gave nothing away, and told him she would need exactly one thing from him before agreeing to anything. His word, plainly given, that this was his own choosing and not some notion he had talked himself into, out of spite for the reverend who had refused him. Silas gave her that word without hesitation, and Ruth Calloway, Justice of the Peace for a county twice the size of some eastern states, told him she had married stranger and less certain couples than this on considerably less evidence, and that she would ride back with him at first light. While Silas slept badly in a borrowed bed at Larimer Flats with his boots finally properly dry for the first time in a day, Hayon spent that same night 60 miles west, sitting up in her room above the mercantile with her father's tin box open on the table before her, and a train timetable borrowed from the depot agent under a thin pretext spread out beside it. She had told herself hours earlier that she was only calculating, not deciding, the difference between those two things thinning with every hour that passed without word, without any way for word to reach her at all. Only wind against glass and a silence that had started sometime around midnight to feel less like waiting and more like grief rehearsing itself in advance. She did not sleep. She sat with her mother's absence and her father's box and the particular, specific fear of loving a man who might, at that very hour, already be lying somewhere in snow he would not rise from. Twice she rose and stood at the window, as though the act of standing might somehow hurry the dawn along, and twice she made herself sit back down, folding her hands the way her mother had once folded hers over an altar cloth. Patience practiced as a discipline rather than felt as any kind of comfort at all. Dawn came gray and reluctant, and with it, unexpectedly, Reverend Josiah Pratt again, this time with actual coffee and no housekeeper trailing behind him for cover, sitting across her small table without invitation and without, for once, his Bible anywhere in evidence. He did not offer comfort exactly, being unpracticed at it after so many years of offering certainty instead, but he sat with her through the worst hour of that long night's aftermath and told her, eventually, haltingly, about his own wife again, about how the 11 years since had taught him that a person could survive losing someone and still fail entirely to learn anything useful from the surviving, unless they made themselves learn it on purpose. Hayon asked him, not unkindly, whether that was an apology. Pratt considered the question with the same slow seriousness he gave Scripture, and told her that he thought it might be the beginning of one, and that he intended, if Silas made it back at all, to finish it properly in front of the whole town this time. Hayon did not answer him with words. She simply poured him a second cup of coffee, unasked, which Reverend Pratt understood correctly, as roughly the most forgiveness either of them had any honest right to expect this particular morning. Silas and Ruth Calloway left Larimer Flats before full light. The storm thinned to a steady, manageable snow rather than the blind chaos of the night before, and the justice proved, to Silas's considerable relief, as capable a rider as she was a jurist, matching his pace mile for mile without complaint through country that had turned entirely white overnight. She asked him, somewhere around the 10th mile, whether he had considered that the Reverend might simply refuse to acknowledge a marriage performed by a county official rather than a man of God. And Silas told her, honestly, that he had considered it and found he did not particularly care, that Haitian deserved a wedding, witnessed by a town, whether that town's own preacher approved the paperwork behind it or not. Ruth Calloway seemed to find that answer sufficient and said nothing further on the subject for several miles, though Silas noticed she rode, from then on, with the faint and satisfied look of a woman confirming a decision she had already privately made the night before. She asked him once, lightly, whether he intended to bring flowers, and when Silas admitted there was nothing blooming for 60 miles in any direction in November, she laughed for the first time since he had met her, a short, dry sound entirely at odds with the endless white country around them. The gray gelding pushed hard for nearly a full day, and a night now, with only a few hours rest at Larimer Flats, began favoring its off foreleg somewhere past the halfway point. Not badly, but enough that Silas dismounted immediately and walked it the next mile by hand. checking the hoof by feel for a stone or a crack that the storm's aftermath had left half buried in fresh snow. He found nothing conclusive, only ordinary exhaustion, wearing at an animal that had already given more than any fair owner should have asked of it, and made the decision, without much internal argument, to slow their pace by half rather than risk the horse entirely for the sake of an hour saved. Ruth Calloway did not object, though the delay cost them daylight they could ill afford to lose, and told him only that a bridegroom who ruined a good horse to arrive an hour earlier would make a poor advertisement for the marriage that followed. Silas walked beside the gelding a while longer than strictly necessary anyway, one hand resting on its neck, murmuring the same low-nonsense words he had once used to gentle spooked cattle, until the animal's breathing steadied enough for him, finally, to trust it with his weight again. Back in Cutter's Ridge, the second full day of waiting had done something to Hyun that the first had not, wearing away the careful calm she had maintained since the chapel door, until only a thin, brittle version of it remained. She dressed that morning anyway, out of a stubbornness she did not fully understand herself, in the same borrowed cloth wedding dress she had worn 2 days before, pinning her mother's ribbon into place with hands that had finally, mercifully stopped shaking sometime overnight, and told Agatha Voss, when the older woman arrived to check on her, that she intended to be ready the moment word came, whichever kind of word it turned out to be. Agatha did not argue with the logic of grieving in a wedding dress, having buried a husband of her own in circumstances that had taught her exactly how little sense grief was obligated to make, and instead simply sat with her, the two of them watching the same gray window they had watched the night before. Around midday, Reverend Pratt sent word by way of a boy that the chapel bell would ring the moment any word at all reached town, good or bad, so that Haeun would not have to sit wondering whether anyone was watching the road but her. Word did come, finally, a little past noon, though not in any form Hyun had prepared herself for. Not a rider alone at a gallop, not a telegram, but the mercantile owner's boy running the length of the street, shouting that something was coming down the eastern road. 2 horses, moving slow, and the whole of Cutter's Ridge, every soul in it that had spent 2 days pretending not to care how this ended, poured out of doors and shop fronts and the chapel itself to see for themselves. Haitian reached the street before she had consciously decided to run there at all, still in her wedding dress, the cold barely registering against skin that had gone numb to everything except the shapes resolving slowly out of the gray distance. 2 riders, moving at a walk, one of them wrapped in a blanket that did not fully hide a familiar duster coat beneath it. Somewhere behind her, the chapel bell finally began to ring, exactly as promised, and the whole street seemed to hold one long collective breath, between each slow, deliberate toll of it, waiting to learn what kind of news the sound was meant to carry. She did not run to him, not yet, some old instinct holding her rooted at the edge of the street while the whole town watched her watching. But she felt every separate second of the last 100 yards those horses had to cover as its own small, unbearable eternity, until Silas swung down from the saddle with the particular stiffness of a body that had spent 2 days fighting cold and distance both, and crossed the remaining ground toward her at something that was not quite a run, only because his legs would not fully allow it yet. He reached her finally in front of the entire watching street, and the first thing he did, before any word passed between them at all, was reach into his coat, with fingers still clumsy from cold, and press her mother's ribbon, slightly stiffened by ice but whole and entirely intact, back into her hand. Only then, with the ribbon safely returned, did he finally allow himself to say her name aloud, roughly, the way a man says a word he has been rationing for 2 days on purpose, so it would not run out before he reached her. Just as Ruth Calloway dismounted more slowly, joints stiff from a day and a half nearly constantly in the saddle, and surveyed the gathered street of Cutter's Ridge with the calm, unhurried authority of a woman who had married exactly this kind of stubborn frontier couple more times than the town could count. She asked, to the crowd generally, whether there was a reason a wedding could not proceed immediately, given that she had ridden 60 miles specifically to prevent any further delay to it. And it was Reverend Josiah Pratt, stepping forward from the chapel steps where he had been standing since the shouting first started, who answered her, his voice carrying clearly over a street gone entirely silent to hear it. He said that there was no reason at all, that he had been wrong 2 mornings before, in ways he intended to spend considerably more effort correcting than he had spent making the mistake, and that if Justice Calloway would permit it, He would like to stand beside her for this ceremony, rather than merely watch it from a distance he no longer believed he had earned. It was an unusual wedding by any measure, performed on the frozen street of Cutter's Ridge rather than inside any building at all. Justice Ruth Calloway reading the civil vows in a clear, carrying voice, while Reverend Pratt stood beside her, Bible open now, rather than closed against his chest, adding a blessing at the end that no one present had asked him for, but that no one, including Heyoon, found themselves inclined to refuse. Heyoon wore her mother's indigo ribbon knotted once more through her braid, the same ribbon that had crossed an ocean and now 60 freezing miles. Besides, and when the moment came for some token to be exchanged, she took the small square of matching silk from her bojagi bundle and tied it deliberately around Silas's wrist in place of the plain leather cord he usually wore there, telling him in English that no longer needed to be careful because it had, somewhere over these past months, simply become fluent, that it had already proven it could survive a long, hard distance. And so, she trusted, could they? The town that watched that wedding was not suddenly a perfect town. The Dunmores stood at the back of the crowd through the entire ceremony with their arms crossed and their opinions visibly unchanged, and Heyeon did not expect, nor particularly want, every closed door in Cutter's Ridge to swing open simply because a justice of the peace had ridden 60 miles through snow to prove a point. But enough of the town had turned out, and stayed, and watched Silas Rourke choose her publicly, completely, at considerable and visible cost to himself, that something in the street's collective posture toward her shifted permanently that afternoon. In the particular way, a town's opinion shifts not through argument, but through witnessing something it cannot afterward pretend it has not seen. Agatha Voss cried openly through the whole ceremony and did not apologize for it once. Even Cole Dunmore, arms crossed at the back, was seen afterward removing his hat a beat later than the rest of the crowd. A small and grudging courtesy he likely did not intend anyone to notice, though Heyeon, from the corner of her eye, noticed it anyway. They spent that first night as a married couple in Silas's homestead, rather than travel any further in weather that had not yet finished with the county, and Heyeon, walking through rooms that were now legally, unambiguously hers as much as his, found a small space on the mantel that she claimed without asking permission for it, setting her father's tin box there beside a framed, careful sketch Silas had once had made of Bess as a girl. Two griefs given equal room at last in the same warm house, rather than carried alone in separate silences. She unfolded her mother's spare length of indigo silk that evening, the one that had never left the bojagi bundle, and pinned it instead to the wall beside the mantel, a small, deliberate flag of everything she had carried across an ocean and had, finally, in this particular house, stopped needing to hide. Silas watched her do it without comment, then added wordlessly the small stone he had once carried up from Bess's marker years before and kept in his coat pocket ever since, setting it on the mantel's opposite end, as though the room itself were being asked to hold both of their histories evenly. Spring came early to Cutter's Ridge that following year, the way it sometimes does after a hard winter, as though the land itself were eager to apologize for what it had put everyone through. And by then, the homestead the town had once quietly agreed not to visit had become, gradually and almost without anyone formally deciding it, a place people simply stopped in on their way past. Agatha Voss most Sundays, Reverend Pratt occasionally with considerably less stiffness in his shoulders than he had once carried, even once a shame-faced Cole Dunmore returning a borrowed plow with an apology he did not quite manage to say aloud, but delivered anyway in the plain Western currency of showing up and doing right by a neighbor. Heyoon kept her mother's ribbon pinned by the mantel where anyone could see it, taught Korean words to whichever child wandered close enough to ask, and told the story of the 60-mile ride, when asked, exactly the way it had happened. Not as a rescue, but as a man simply refusing once and for all to let distance decide anything that mattered ever again.